around 1700, there was a lot of other metaphysical philosophy going on in the 18th century before Kant. So that there were successors of Leibniz in the German rationalism of the 18th century. And it was under these people that Immanuel Kant had studied himself, so that he was raised in the rationalistic tradition that had derived from Descartes' methodological revolution, you see. Now, he tells us he was awakened from those dogmatic slumbers by reading David Hume. Those dogmatic slumbers being the uncritical metaphysical assertions of that kind of system. And certainly Hume should awaken such people. So when he ventures his own project, his project is critical philosophy. That is to say, trying to examine the conditions which would make metaphysics possible, criticizing the epistemological foundations of metaphysics, a critique in that sense. So his major work, in which he's now introducing us to, is called, you notice, a critique, critical philosophy, a critique of pure reason, pure, that is to say, a priori, without any empirical input. So he's trying to look critically at the possibilities that lie in pure reason, reason independently of experience, possibilities for metaphysics. Okay? A critique of pure reason, having to do with metaphysical knowledge and the traditional approach to metaphysical knowledge. So let's say having to do with traditional metaphysical knowledge. Okay? Now, you'll find that in addition to that first critique in 1781, he came up a little later with a second critique, a critique of practical reason. Now, the third term, practical reason, ever since Aristotle, has referred to ethical thinking. So this turns out to be a critique not of metaphysical knowledge, but of moral knowledge. Now, remember that in that metaphysical tradition, it was maintained that moral knowledge was as deducible from first truths as was metaphysical knowledge. You see? John Locke thought that in principle, at least, we should be able to derive moral knowledge in the same way as we get mathematical knowledge, deductively, from intuitive first principles or something, or from our knowledge of the nature of man, in the case of morals. And David Hume, in his first chapter to the Inquiry, you remember, distinguishes between abstract and practical philosophy, where abstract philosophy is about metaphysics, practical philosophy is moral philosophy, you see. And the phrase moral philosophy was really not just ethics, but political theory and anything else that had application to human action. So a critique of practical reason is a critique then of the epistemological status of moral knowledge. And subsequently he produced a third critique. This was a critique of judgment. And that has to do with aesthetic judgment, aesthetic knowledge, both in regards to nature, where we come up with all sorts of judgments about the order. You see, the orderedness of nature was the thing that the 18th century scientific mind was so set on. The orderedness of nature, the beauty of nature. So in aesthetic judgment in regards to nature, and in regards to works of art. Now, aesthetic knowledge had been likened to moral knowledge by David Hume and by some of the moral sense philosophers, you see. So having dealt with moral knowledge, he now comes to this other, aesthetic knowledge. Raises questions there. And in each case, what he is looking at, or trying to look at, is the preconditions that would make knowledge judgments possible. The preconditions for the very possibility of moral knowledge, of aesthetic knowledge, metaphysical knowledge. Now, you might note this in anticipation, that the critique of pure reason comes to the conclusion that there is no possibility of metaphysical knowledge in the traditional sense that involves objectivity and logical certainty. Okay. Dogmatic certainty in matters of metaphysics is not possible. And that applies to the three areas of metaphysics which were dominant in his day. They divided in the German rationalist tradition metaphysics into three parts. Christian Wolff, one of them, divided it into philosophical psychology, philosophical cosmology, and philosophical theology, dealing obviously with mind, nature, and God. And of course, when you've talked about those three, there isn't a great deal left to talk about. Nature, mind, and God. So it's pretty embracing. So his conclusions about natural theology, theology by reason alone, are negative. He critiques the arguments for the existence of God on the basis of lacking adequate preconditions that make it possible. But here's the interesting thing, that he goes on to suggest, to argue that metaphysical belief is possible on the basis, yes, of some things in the traditional approach to metaphysics, but is possible on the basis of moral and aesthetic knowledge. So it's on this basis, as well as on this basis, that we develop appropriately metaphysical beliefs. So again, you get the distinction between knowledge and belief. You see? Kant critiques the possibility of metaphysical knowledge, logical certainty, but finds in all three of his critiques that there is a basis for certain metaphysical beliefs, including belief in God. So that's the overall picture. Now we have to add that his desire to make this accessible led to more readable and briefer versions of the first two. So the briefer version of the first one is the thing I read to you from just now, the prolegomena to any future metaphysic. Okay. And the briefer version of the Critique of Practical Reason is the metaphysical foundations of morals. And typically the selection about Kant's categorical imperative in ethics, which we have people read in introductory courses, comes from the metaphysical foundations of morals. Okay. So, that's the picture. He did do a work also specifically on religion called Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone. Where you can see he's asking about the possibilities of religious knowledge independently of revelation. What sort of knowledge of God do we get that way? Okay. We'll have something to say about all of these works over the next couple of weeks. Okay, any question, comment there? All of that in reference to what he means by critical philosophy. Okay. After all, if critical philosophy is his project, you have to talk about his whole project, you see. Who did I see? Yes.
You said that his metaphysical beliefs are based on the moral knowledge and the aesthetic knowledge?
Yeah.
Primarily those two, or does the first one come in?
The first one comes in as well. That's why I have this arrow coming down. Okay. His conclusion to, and we've got a bit of it in the anthology, his conclusion to the first critique is, in effect, no, we only have knowledge of appearances, phenomena. But on the other hand, for practical reasons, we're constrained to believe. You see, it's a little more than a psychology of belief. But again, he's appealing to what Hume and the Scottish realists called the proclivities of the human mind. You see, the proclivities of the human mind. Yeah. Yeah, so all three of them contribute to metaphysical beliefs. Trouble is that just as with Hume, people sometimes read just the first 4 sections, find Hume's a skeptic, and then forget what comes later. So with Kant, they read to his negative conclusions and ignore what comes later. You see. But Hume's conclusion, just as Hume's conclusion is about belief, so Kant's conclusion is about belief. In fact, there's one place in his preface to the first critique where he says we'll have to do away with knowledge to make room for belief. Do away with knowledge to make room for belief. You see, what he's doing, if you want to go back to